Hi everyone, thanks for watching this talk. My name is Gavin Brookes. I'm a research fellow from Lancaster University, and today I'm going to present some work that I've been doing looking at metaphors that are used to represent dementia in British newspapers. So the work I'm presenting today is from the Public Discourses of Dementia project. This is a recently started project funded by UKRI based at Lancaster University. There are two of us working on the project, and you can see us here on this slide. So I'm the PI, and I'm working with Emma Putland, who's the Senior Research Associate. The project will run for 4 years, and as part of it, we're exploring how dementia is represented in language and imagery across a range of contexts of public communication in the UK. So this includes news, social media, online support groups, public health campaigns, and charity discourse. Importantly, we're working with stakeholders from the media and charities and public health too, all with the aim of developing linguistically informed, context-sensitive guidance for how public communicators can talk about dementia in ways that reduce the stigma around the syndrome and raise genuine awareness of it. In this talk, I'm going to share some work we've been doing trying to understand metaphorical representations of dementia in the news, focusing here on the tabloids. Before I get into the research though, I first want to provide a bit of context about dementia. So dementia is a syndrome characterized by progressive deterioration in the brain, and this leads to memory loss and problems with thinking and coordination. The term dementia is actually an umbrella term, so it doesn't refer to a specific disease, but actually has 100 types, over 100 types. And this is visualized quite well by this graphic from Kate Swaffer. So the most common type of dementia is Alzheimer's disease, but other common types include vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, and frontotemporal dementia. Dementia presents a major global public health challenge. In the UK, which is the context of this research, dementia currently affects 900,000 people, and this figure is estimated to rise to 1.6 million people by the year 2040. There's presently no known cure for dementia. It's a chronic disease, and people who develop dementia will eventually die with it. However, and importantly, while people die with dementia, they don't actually die of it. The most common cause of death in people with dementia is actually pneumonia. So on to the research. And for this analysis, I compiled a corpus containing all UK national tabloid articles mentioning either the word dementia or dementias once in their headline and or 3 or more times throughout the article. I sampled across articles across a 10-year period between 2010 and 2019, and this gave 6,751 articles, which amounted to a corpus of just under 4 million words. And the analytical approach I took to identifying and interpreting the use of metaphor was a sort of mixed methodology, which drew together techniques from corpus linguistics, frame analysis, and critical discourse studies. So I started by using the corpus linguistic technique of collocation analysis to identify metaphorical patterns. Specifically, using the parameters on this slide, I obtained a list of collocates of the word dementia. I then qualitatively analysed samples of the collocates in use and used the Prevalence metaphor identification procedure to decide whether or not a collocate tended to be used in a metaphorical sense and to represent dementia or some aspect relating to it. I then interpreted those collocates that did tend to be used metaphorically in terms of the frames that they contributed towards. And here I draw on Goffman's notion of frames as organising principles, which help us to make sense of a thing and to represent it by foregrounding some elements and backgrounding others. And here I was also inspired really by the likes of Elena Somino and Dima Tanasova, who have applied frame analysis to analyse metaphors of health and illness quite productively in previous research. Through the framing analysis, I was able to group the metaphors according to the particular aspects of dementia or the particular target domains that each metaphor was used to frame in the news articles. And these were dementia's prevalence, its causes, its symptoms and prognosis, lived experience of dementia, and then finally responses to it. And then my analysis, importantly, was also critical, and I was interested in interpreting the frames as being both constitutive of and constituted by their contexts. In terms of the context of production, I considered how the metaphorical framings might serve the commercial and ideological aims of the tabloids I was investigating. And in terms of the broader socio-cultural context, I wanted to consider how the framings might reflect, but also shape, societal experiences, understandings of, and indeed actions relating to dementia. So onto the analysis, and here I want to consider some of the most frequent metaphorical framings in relation to the different aspects of dementia that were represented, or target domains that I identified. And I'll begin here with dementia's prevalence. And this was framed using metaphors belonging to a diverse range of domains, all of which conveyed a sense in which the UK's prevalence of dementia is high and also rising. Most frequently, the articles draw on a domain of sports and competition to frame dementia as the leading cause of death in the country. This was indicated in uses of collocates such as leading, leader, overtaken, and overtook. For example, in this extract at the top of the slide, where dementia is framed as overtaking heart disease to become the leading cause of death. Violence metaphors were also used to frame dementia prevalence, where the incidence of the condition was quantified in terms of the number of people who had been hit by dementia, or what dementia's death toll was. Related to the violence metaphor, dementia was also construed as a weapon, a bomb, and specifically a time bomb, and this was a representation which foregrounds more specifically dementia's rising prevalence, and which implies that this will continue to grow and to disastrous effect in the future. Dementia's growing prevalence was also rendered as an epidemic, and in around a fifth of cases as a silent epidemic. At first glance, the characterization of dementia as an epidemic may not appear metaphorical, since the term already belongs to the domain of illness. However, strictly speaking, the term epidemic denotes the spread of an infectious disease, which dementia is not. In the general language British national corpus, we find that the epidemic metaphor tends to be used to characterize an increase in the frequency of some phenomenon or activity that is evaluated negatively. So we get epidemics of knife crime or the illegal use of drugs, for example. Therefore, like the ticking time bomb metaphor, the epidemic metaphor provides a negative evaluation of the growth of dementia prevalence. Moving on to dementia's causes, and these could be framed using the domain of movement, and certain behaviours and risk factors being construed as speeding up the development of dementia, so we get collocates like accelerate, accelerated, and speeds. As well as focusing on the environmental risks associated with dementia, the newspapers also reported on biological factors, particularly protein variants and parts of the brain to which dementia onset had been attributed. These risks could be framed through violence tropes, whereby parts of the brain are anthropomorphized, for example as rogue, or likened to a dagger which then attacks other parts of the brain to cause dementia. And as this bottom example shows, these metaphors aren't necessarily invented by the newspapers, but they can be borrowed from other genres, in this case from scientific writing. So we're beginning to see a prevalence of violence or militaristic tropes, and this was particularly the case in how the newspapers framed dementia's symptoms and prognosis. In these cases, dementia is anthropomorphized again as an actor, and one which inflicts forms of violence on those diagnosed with it. And these can be subcategorized too. So symptoms such as loss of memory, cognitive function, and even loss of personhood are framed as being stolen by dementia, which is rendered as a thief who robs and steals. Other symptoms are framed as forms of violence in more generic terms, with dementia described as something which ravages and strikes. In terms of its prognosis, the newspapers frequently foreground a fatalistic view of dementia, framing it as a murderer that kills those diagnosed with it. So we see this in a large number of highly frequent collocates, which include kill, killed, killer, killers, killing, and kills. And then this fatalistic framing is supported by the anthropomorphic characterization of dementia in terms of qualities which imply it to be a violent actor who inflicts such violence and theft willingly and deliberately. So we get collocates such as brutally, cruel, cruelest, heartless, and savage. Consistent with the metaphorical framing of dementia as a cruel and brutal actor who inflicts forms of violence on people diagnosed with it, the lived experience of dementia was also characterized in terms of conflict. And again, these violence tropes can be subcategorized. So people with dementia are framed as battling, facing, and struggling dementia, and this manifested in a number of collocates. So we get collocates such as battle, battled, battles, battling, face, faces, fight, fighting, fights, struggle, and struggling. Other constructions were less agentive on the part of people with dementia, though, and instead foregrounded their victimhood. In such cases, people with dementia were referred to as a victim or victims. They were described as being in dementia's grip or hold, and as being struck by dementia. Meanwhile, the framing of people with dementia as succumbing or having succumbed to dementia arguably implies an initial struggle or resistance, but an eventual failure or even surrender. Another set of metaphors which similarly frame people with dementia as objects or victims of processes are found in stories which focus in particular on cases where people with dementia have been purportedly abandoned by their relatives, where this process is metaphorically likened to that of waste disposal. So these types of articles describe how people with dementia are dumped in care homes and hospitals, like in this bottom example. The negative appraisal of life with dementia is also conveyed through metaphors which frame the experience of dementia in horrific or even apocalyptic terms. So it's likened to hell, a horror movie, and a nightmare, for example. A negative evaluation of life with dementia is also conveyed more subtly through the collocate descent, whose use indicates a spatial metaphor which frames life with dementia as downward movement into the condition. And this draws on the broader down equals bad metaphor. And it does this to provide a negative evaluation of life with dementia. Not all metaphors necessarily imply negative evaluations of life with the syndrome, or necessarily foreground the victimhood of people diagnosed with it. For example, a particularly frequent metaphor is the characterization of the relationship between dementia and the person with it as one of companionship. This was indicated in uses of the collocates live and living. The companionship metaphor is more flexible than those seen so far in this section, as it could be used to frame the relationship between dementia and people with it in more or less harmonious terms, as this pair of examples demonstrates. Likewise, the metaphorical framing of dementia as a journey could be used to appraise life with the syndrome in more or less positive terms, as well as to foreground mixed experiences and dementia's progressive nature. Finally, now we consider responses to dementia. The most pervasive metaphorical domain in this category, in terms of its frequency and number of collocates, is again violence. Most of the metaphors in this domain frame the response to dementia from society as a whole, as well as from biomedicine in terms of the development of a pharmacological cure. This response is framed in terms of conflict in general, as well as more specifically in terms of a battle, a mission, a fight, and a war against dementia. In all cases analysed, the key to victory in the conflict tends to be the development of pharmacological interventions for dementia, and funding for this. Relatedly, the promise of studies and pharmacological trials could be framed as having the potential to beat dementia in a race, or to slow, stop, or reverse dementia's movement. Other metaphors imply that a cure for dementia exists, but has yet to be found by scientists, who are framed as undertaking a quest or hunt for a cure, or for clues or the key to curing dementia. Although the vast majority of metaphors focused on biomedical responses to dementia, in a small minority of cases the articles draw on gambling metaphors to critique inconsistency in the provision of social care. In this representation, the public were positioned as being at the mercy of a postcode lottery or Russian roulette regarding the social care services available to them and how prepared local hospitals are to treat patients with dementia. So this has been a bit of a whistle-stop tour of a wider programme of work, but I hope I've been able to illustrate some of the more prominent metaphorical patterns in dementia press representation. The analysis uncovered a range of tropes, with a particular prominence of anthropomorphizing metaphors which equate dementia variously to a companion, a competitor in a race, and most commonly a violent killer. Almost all metaphors foreground the agency of dementia, in many cases anthropomorphizing it as a social actor, as I've mentioned, while these metaphors also background or preclude altogether the agency of people diagnosed with dementia. As an agentive force, dementia moves and invades, races against and hides from those seeking to remedy it, and competes with other conditions to become the leading cause of death. People with dementia, meanwhile, are largely denied agency, tending instead to be rendered as the target of the violent actions of dementia, such as murder and theft. Violence metaphors have the potential to stigmatize by framing people affected by an illness as the enemy of the war, and their bodies as metaphorical battlefields. And indeed, we saw how in this process the press could represent parts of the dementia brain as treacherous weapons which inflict violence on the rest of the brain. A further issue with the violence metaphors is that if the disease prevails and the person fails to recover, then those affected could then be viewed as having lost the metaphorical battle. Given that dementia is chronic syndrome with no known cure, this is a battle that people diagnosed with the syndrome will inevitably lose. Yet dementia stigma is propagated not only through metaphors of violence, but also by a wider set of metaphorical framings, many of which I identified in my analysis, including those of horrors and nightmares, and the dehumanizing equation of people with dementia to waste being disposed of. All of these prominent tropes foreground dementia's most disastrous and fear-inducing aspects, while backgrounding, if not shutting down altogether, the possibility of living well with dementia following diagnosis, as many people do with the right support. The impacts of dementia stigma on people's lives and society as a whole can be severe. It's been found to engender feelings of shame in people with dementia, and can prevent them from seeking diagnosis and medical support, as well as making them less willing to participate in research. Stigma can also distort healthcare services for people with dementia, including frontline provision and resource allocation. For the general public, it can create fear, misunderstanding, and negative attitudes around dementia, making people fearful of the syndrome and less likely to want to communicate with a person diagnosed with it. While people with dementia were rendered as providing little, if any, opposition to the syndrome, agency was instead ascribed to those responsible for developing curative, pharmacological solutions. This focus not only results in emphasis being placed on prospective treatments that are not currently available, but it also serves to simultaneously shift focus away from other non-pharmacological responses, such as arts-based therapies, as well as other initiatives that are designed to help people manage and live with dementia in the here and now. Finding a cure for dementia is, of course, a worthwhile endeavour. However, relative to the financial support that's granted to pharmacological research, social care for people with dementia is already chronically underfunded. Given the power of the media to influence public and policymaker attitudes to public health issues, metaphors which place so much emphasis on yet to be developed cures are only likely to widen this funding imbalance. Indeed, metaphors which frame the pursuit for a cure as a hunt or a puzzle may imply that there is a cure out there somewhere if only scientists are able to find it. The gambling metaphors I identified that were used to expose inconsistencies in care quality do at least offer a refreshing focus on social care, though these are far less frequent than those which foreground pharmacological responses. A defense of these linguistic tropes is that they allow the newspapers to reify what is, in dementia, an otherwise largely invisible disease. Dementia is a complex syndrome, and it can be difficult to understand. So it might be the case that these anthropomorphizing metaphors confer a measure of symbolic order over dementia, giving us at least the impression that we understand it. But we may question the extent to which many of the metaphors I have identified are indeed likely to improve public understanding of dementia. For example, metaphors which represent dementia's prevalence as wide and growing were seldom accompanied by any discussion of the epidemiological niceties which are likely to give us an inflated impression of its rates of occurrence. So this includes factors such as the UK's ageing population and improved methods of detection. Such optimistic counter-arguments do, of course, run contrary to the news value of negativity and would arguably make for less sensational headlines. And the news agencies studied here may contend that their priority is to sell newspapers rather than raise awareness. However, I think it's also important to reflect critically on the likely trade-off between raising profits versus raising awareness, and the ramifications that this may have for the lives of people with dementia. It's not all bad news though, and some of the metaphors I identified may be more helpful in terms of reducing stigma and raising awareness. In particular, those which frame the experience of dementia as a journey or which characterize it as companionship, respectively articulate the progressive and chronic nature of the syndrome. These tropes are also used more flexibly than the violence ones. They can ascribe agency to the person with dementia and can be used to foreground dementia's positive and/or negative aspects. Journey and companionship metaphors are therefore able to account more flexibly for differences in subjective experiences of dementia, as well as variations in an individual's experiences. Indeed, just as dementia is experienced differently between individuals, a single person can experience their dementia differently from day to day, and the journey and companionship metaphors seem to be better able to convey this reality. Here are the references. Thank you for listening.